Good evening. It's Wednesday at 7 o'clock, which means another live from me, Shaz Nawaz. And this week, I promised you to do a Q&A. So as you tune in, feel free to post any comments or questions, and I'll be happy to answer as many as I can. I'm here for as long as you keep posting questions, and I'll answer them as thoroughly as I can. If I can't, I'll always come back to you because either I'll need more information or perhaps it's a very detailed answer, and in order to be fair to you, I'll give you more time by answering it offline. But I have had some questions from people in advance, so I'll answer those as people tune in and want to ask questions. So I had a question from Nag. In fact, he's asked two questions, which is, hi Shaz, I have two questions with regard to my own home. The first one is, he's read somewhere that if he must own a very luxurious or expensive home, or as expensive as he can afford, because if when he gets a mortgage, it's going to be a low interest mortgage and there'll be no capital gains tax to pay. So to answer the first part of the question, Nag, my advice to you would be, buy a home that you can afford. So if you can afford a luxurious home, absolutely go for it. But if you can't and you're going to stretch yourself just because of capital gains tax, or someone's told you you should be buying a luxurious home, then in my opinion, that's a pretty bad idea. And in order to be financially well managed, you need to make sure you live well within your means, because I think that's extremely important. So work out a budget of how much disposable income you have every single month, and then assign a proportion of that to pay towards your mortgage. Some people do 30%, some do 40%, some do 50%. I'm not going to tell you how much I think you should do, but decide on what figure works best for you, and don't just buy a big expensive house just because you think that's what people ought to do. The second part of your question, on question one, about not paying capital gains tax, you're absolutely right. You can claim principal residence relief, which means if you've lived in the house through the entirety of ownership, there's no capital gains tax for you to pay whatsoever. The second part of your question, or the second question, is, if we are planning to have a home around £2 million, it's best to build it ourselves by purchasing land in the desired area, as it helps with stamp duty land tax. You're absolutely right, because obviously, if you buy a £2 million home, you'll have a significant stamp duty land tax uh, to pay. On top of that, if it's your second or additional property, you've got the additional 3% to pay. So if you buy land, you'll be paying non-residential rate of SDLT, which usually work out to be lower. So for the first £150,000, no SDLT. Next 100,000, 2%, which takes you to 250 grand, and over 250 grand, you'll be paying 5%. So most likely, the SDLT will be lower. And of course, we've already covered, if you live in the house through the entirety of ownership, no SDLT, no capital gains tax to pay. Have a question from a Facebook viewer, which is, I know some investors that have set up a new co for every property they purchase, and others have put property into. Okay, I know that there are many variables. Generally speaking, what would you say is the best route of the two? So thank you for the question. I'll put it on screen so everybody can read the question, save me reading it. Generally speaking, I'd say if you're buying all the properties yourself for yourself, then and you've explored buying the properties in your own name as a partnership, as a limited liability partnership, which is like a partnership with limited liability, with the clues in the name, and a limited company. And let's say the advice to you is to buy in a limited company. As long as you're buying all the properties for yourself, then I'll say keep the same company for all your properties. And by that I mean, if you were, let's say, into single lets, if you're buying single lets going forward, then buy them all in that particular company. The challenge arises if you want to do a JV for a property with somebody else. Then of course there's no point you adding them on as a shareholder to your existing company, because you're then giving them equity into properties that you have previously purchased. In that case, you'd start another company if that were the best way forward for you, and both you and the other partner or shareholder would own part of that company. Alongside that, let's say if you, once you've done a few single lets, you then decide you want to do commercial conversions and buy and refurb or redevelop and sell, or you want to go into serviced accommodation or a different property strategy, then my advice would be, have a different and separate structure for that If again, if a limited company was the best route on the advice you were given, then I'd set up a separate limited company for that particular operation. But same strategy, same people or persons owning the properties, then keep it in the same company, because there's no point you having 5 separate limited companies for 5 separate properties that you own, which let's say all happen to be single lets, because you're just increasing fees, increasing admin, more bank accounts, more tax returns to do. You don't need the extra headache. Keep it simple. And if you got any further questions on that, feel free to ask. Also, I had a question from GBiz, who said, "Hi Shaz, I want to know if it's better to buy a property through one limited company or set up a new co every time I buy a new property." And lo and behold, that question has already been asked tonight, so I've already covered that. Have a question from Kazana Rana. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And it's, I have 3 properties to myself. One is residential, 2 are buy-to-let with tenants. I'm looking for another property sold for a buy-to-let. I work full-time, earning 24 grand a year. How do I save with income tax? That all depends really on how much profit you're making from the 2 properties that you already have in your name. So obviously, I don't know that particular figure, but if you're looking to buy a third property, something you ought to be thinking about is whether you should incorporate your property portfolio, or sorry, whether you should buy future properties in a limited company, simply because once you go into the higher rate of tax, then Section 24 will affect you, which means you can't claim all your finance costs. And that can be pretty painful depending on how much interest you're paying on those mortgages. So that's one route that you ought to be thinking about very clearly, but without looking into detail in terms of exactly what costs you're incurring, Ms. Rana, I'm unable to tell you exactly how you can save income tax. But if I have more information about who else owns the properties, or if you own them just in your own name, and then you've got a husband or a wife who perhaps has less income or no income, and possibly adding them onto your property portfolio may help you reduce your income tax position. But I'd need more information in order to do that. Okay, had another question here from Natalie, who said, "What if I lived in the property for a few years and then moved out and rented it? Can I move back in the property and not pay capital gains tax?" So here, basically, the scenario presented by Natalie, although she hasn't spelled it out, is she owns a property which she's lived in. She then moves out and rents it out, and after a while wants to move back into the property and then possibly sell it. And if she does that, is she going to pay any capital gains tax? And the answer partly is it depends on obviously how much the capital value has appreciated by in that particular property, Natalie. But to keep it really simple, if you move out of a property and then move back in, for the period that you haven't lived in the property, you'll have to pay capital gains tax on that proportion, depending on the overall increase in value. If you rented it out for the last 9 months of ownership, so let's say you've lived in the property for 10 years and then you rent it out for the last 9 months and then sell it, those 9 months are deemed to be your occupation, so you wouldn't pay any capital gains tax for that 9 month period. If, however, you've lived in the property for 5 years, rent it for 2 years, and then go back and move into it for another year before you sell it, then the last year plus the first 5 years, there's no capital gains tax under your principal residence relief, as long as that was your main and only residence. But the years in between which you rented the property out for, you'll have to pay capital gains tax depending on what the total gain is. And so that's the question answered by Natalie. We don't have any other questions, but what I will say to you is, if you are listen to podcasts, feel free to obviously follow and listen to my podcast, which is Wealth Made Simple. If you're on Facebook, join our Facebook group called Entrust Property Tax Experts. And if you're on YouTube, which where most people are nowadays, because I spend my time there as well, then subscribe to my YouTube channel, Shaz Nawaz, where I share lots of content only on property, focused on property deals and property investing, and also property tax. Have another question from somebody, which is, if I've got a trading business, would it be better to buy a property through the business or buy it personally or in a company, then rent it to my business? So here I'll assume that what you're saying is you have a trading business, you're looking to buy a property which you are going to rent out to your main business, because that's what the question appears to be. So what I would say to you is possibly think about uh, using SAS, a small self-administered scheme for pension purposes, and buy a commercial property through that. That is highly tax efficient. You need to speak to an independent financial advisor, because I'm not allowed to give you financial advice because I'm not regulated and authorized to do so. But think about using a SAS. That is a highly tax efficient and sensible way of buying commercial property and then leasing it back to your own trading company. If you don't do that, then I would suggest you buy that commercial property in possibly a separate limited company and then charge rent. And the reason why I say that is because you've got limited liability in your trading company. If you buy your commercial property through that particular limited company, if anything were to go wrong and you were to go bankrupt or the company were to be liquidated, then you jeopardize and you may lose that commercial property. Whereas if you have it in a separate wrapper or a separate limited company, at least that's protected. So I'd say either buy it in your own name, depending on your personal circumstances and your income, or through a limited company. But for me, the much preferred route, by the way, is to have it through a SAS. Another question from somebody else, which is from SAS. How about loan interest CIS? Uh, uh, Rez, if you could perhaps expand on that, then I'll happily answer that. Rez has another question, which is how about claiming finance interest in an LLP? So Rez, the rules for, so I assume you're referring to Section 24 here, and if that is correct, then Section 24 affects property owned in your own name, owned in a partnership with one or more other people, and it also affects property owned via an LLP. So if the question is how can I escape Section 24, then limited company route is the way forward. If the question is can I claim all my finance costs in an LLP, well, the answer is if you become a high rate taxpayer, then you can't, because Section 24 rules apply to LLPs alongside sole traders and partnerships. We don't have any other questions, but we've had quite a bit of engagement and quite a few questions asked. I hope you've all found that useful. I'll be live next week, Wednesday, 7 o'clock, and I'll be covering a topic on which I've been asked a lot of questions over the past, I'll say, a couple of years, really, if not longer, which is stamp duty land tax. So I'm going to cover the basics on SDLT and some of the pitfalls where people go wrong, but I'll also share with you something which we've been doing for best part of a year to 18 months or so, which is claiming back a significant amount of stamp duty land tax for a lot of property investors. So tune in next week at 7 o'clock and I'll cover SDLT, or at least the basics of SDLT, to raise your awareness. And feel free to obviously follow my podcast, join the Entrust Property Tax group on Facebook, and subscribe to the Shaz Nawaz YouTube channel, where I go into a lot of detail on a lot of different things to do with property. So until next week, bye for now.